It's a strange thing to have your heart broken by proxy, to feel a seismic crack run through your own foundations, not because of anything you did, not because of any choice you made or word you spoke, but because you are a witness to a profound and personal cataclysm in someone you love more than life itself. It's a peculiar form of suffering, this secondhand devastation, one that our culture rarely acknowledges or names. We have words for the grief of losing a child to death. We have rituals and casseroles and sympathy cards. But what do we call it when your child's soul is wounded so deeply that you can see the light dim in their eyes? What is the name for the helplessness of watching someone you would die for experience a pain you cannot absorb, cannot redirect, cannot take upon yourself no matter how desperately you wish you could? For me, that moment arrived not with a dramatic slam of a door or a shouted accusation, not with the theatrical crescendo we've been trained to expect from years of watching emotional breakdowns depicted in films and television. It came instead in the quiet, hollow, doubt silence of my kitchen on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening in late October. The kind of evening where the light comes through the windows at a slant, golden and dusty, making everything look temporarily beautiful and sad at the same time. I had made pastrigatoni with a simple tomato sauce, the kind of uncomplicated comfort food I'd been making since Leo was 5 years old and would eat nothing but noodles with butter and parmesan. My son Leo, who had carried a universe of quiet intensity in his eyes since he was a small boy, who had always seemed to be contemplating questions too large for his age, looked at me from across that scarred wooden table we'd had since he was in kindergarten. His face was a mask of a pain so refined, so distilled down to its purest essence, that it was almost serene. There was no crying, no dramatic display, just a kind of terrible, hollow calm that frightened me more than any tantrum ever could have. And he said, in a voice stripped of all its youthful music, all the animated inflection that usually characterized his speech when he was excited about an idea, "The one I loved the most is the one who betrayed me." The words didn't just hang in the air like dialogue in a play. They seeped into the walls, they settled into the grain of the wood. They changed the very quality of the light filtering through the kitchen window. I felt them land in my own chest like stones dropping into still water, sending out rings of recognition and dread. In that moment, I understood that something fundamental had shifted in my son's universe, that a load-bearing wall in the architecture of his understanding of the world had been removed, and I didn't yet know if the structure would hold. I had watched this boy love with a ferocity that was almost terrifying in its completeness. It was never a casual thing for him, never light or easy or compartmentalized the way it seemed to be for other children. When other kids in elementary school would have a best friend 1 week and forget them the next, moving through alliances with the fluid pragmatism of politicians, Leo formed bonds that seemed to have gravitational force. When he was 10 years old, he found a sparrow with a broken wing in our backyard. It was late spring, and I remember the specific quality of that morning, the way the grass was still wet with dew, the way the early light made everything look newborn and vulnerable. Another child might have poked it with a stick, called for a parent to do something, or simply walked away, understanding on some instinct level that nature is harsh and small broken things often don't survive. But not Leo. He didn't just shoo it away or call for me to deal with it, to make the problem disappear the way parents are supposed to make problems disappear. Instead, he built a small infirmary out of a shoebox, lining it carefully with torn strips of an old t-shirt to make it soft. He meticulously researched what to feed an injured sparrow online, reading through forums and veterinary sites with the focused intensity of a medical resident. I watched him spend hours, not minutes, but actual hours, just sitting beside that makeshift hospital, his small hand a steady, warm presence near the box, talking to the bird in a low, constant murmur. He didn't see a bird. He saw a life, a responsibility, a creature worthy of absolute devotion. He named it Cicero, after the Roman orator, because he said he wanted it to find its voice again, to sing. For 2 weeks, he woke up early to check on Cicero before school, rushed home to feed it, read beside it while doing his homework. He constructed an entire relationship, a covenant of care, with a wild thing that could give him nothing back. When it finally flew away, launching itself from his cupped palms into the air with a series of clumsy, strengthening wing beats, he didn't cry from sadness, though I had braced myself for it. Instead, his eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of a kind of overwhelming, joyous awe. The recognition of something beautiful and right happening in the world, even if it meant a loss for him personally. It remembered how, he whispered, watching the bird disappear into the maple tree at the edge of our yard. It remembered it could fly. That was his capacity. That was the size and shape of his heart. He loved the world not in broad, easy strokes, not with the casual affection most of us deploy like spare change, but in intense, focused beams of light, like a laser that could cut through steel or heal with precision. And because of that, because of the very intensity and purity of that beam, the shadows it cast were always long and deep. You cannot have that kind of light without the corresponding darkness. It's a law of physics, and perhaps also a law of the human heart. The object of this particular beam of light was a girl named Maya. She wasn't his girlfriend, not in any conventional sense we adults like to categorize these things, not in the way that involves holding in hallways or Instagram posts declaring relationship status or any of the performative rituals of teenage romance. She was something both simpler and vastly more complex. She was his person, his philosophical sparring partner, the co-architect of his private worlds, the one who spoke his language when the rest of the world seemed to be speaking in a different dialect entirely. They met in some advanced placement philosophy class during their junior year of high school. Two young minds vibrating at a frequency most of their peers couldn't even hear, much less join. I remember the first time he mentioned her. It was casual and offhand comment over dinner about how this girl Maya had made an interesting point about Kierkegaard's concept of the leap of faith. But I heard something in his voice, a particular quality of attention, the way you might speak about discovering a new country that speaks your native language. Within weeks, she had become a constant presence in our home, though not always physically. Her name peppered his conversation. Maya thinks that Nietzsche's eternal recurrence is actually more optimistic than pessimistic. Meyer and I were arguing about whether consciousness could emerge from sufficiently complex computation. Meyer introduced me to this philosopher I'd never heard of, Simone Weil. And Mom, you have to read this passage. It was as if he had found a mirror, or perhaps more accurately, a window. Something that reflected him back, but also showed him new landscapes he hadn't known existed. I'd listened to them sometimes, their conversations drifting down from his room like smoke, from some intense intellectual fire burning upstairs. I'd be doing dishes or folding laundry, and I'd pause, captivated by the spiraling debates on Stoicism, and whether Marcus Aurelius was a hypocrite for preaching acceptance while waging brutal wars. They'd argue about the ethics of artificial consciousness, whether a sufficiently advanced AI could suffer, and if so, what moral obligations we'd have toward it. They'd explore the tragic beauty of Camus's absurd hero, Sisyphus, condemned to roll his boulder up the mountain for eternity, and whether finding meaning in meaninglessness was a form of victory or delusion. It was beautiful and a little alien to me, if I'm being honest. I had been a good student, had gone to college, considered myself reasonably intellectual, but this was something else. This wasn't puppy love, wasn't the heated but shallow attractions of adolescence. This was a meeting of twin souls, a recognition that seemed to happen at a level deeper than personality or physical attraction, It was as if two people who had been speaking in code their entire lives suddenly found someone who had the cipher. I met Maya properly for the first time at a debate tournament Leo had invited me to attend. She was striking, but not in a conventional weight. All and angular, with dark hair she wore in a perpetually messy bun, wire, rimmed glasses, and an intensity in her dark eyes that reminded me immediately of Leo. She had that same quality of focused attention, as if whatever she was looking at in the moment was the only thing in the universe worth observing. When she spoke, it was in complete paragraphs, fully formed arguments that seemed to arrive whole rather than being constructed in real time. "You must be Leo's mom," she said, extending her hand with an old-fashioned formality I found charming. "He talks about you constantly. You're the one who introduced him to Ursula Le Guin, right? The ones who walk away from homeless. That story wrecked me for weeks." I liked her immediately, which I now recognize as both a natural response and a terrible irony. She had that quality that made adults trust her, made us think, here is a serious young person, someone with integrity, someone who is going places. She seemed thoughtful, deliberate, morally engaged with the world. She looked you in the eye when she spoke. She asked questions and actually listened to the answers. All the markers we've been trained to recognize as signs of good character. Over the following months, she became woven into the fabric of our lives. She'd stay for dinner at least twice a week, and those meals would stretch for hours as she and Leo would get into passionate debates that I could barely follow. She'd help me clear the table, insisting on doing dishes, and we'd have our own conversations. About books, about her complicated relationship with her own mother, about her plans for college and her terror that she'd never be smart enough, never be enough, period. "Leo's so naturally brilliant," she said to me once, her hands submerged in soapy water, staring out the window above the sink. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just scrambling to keep up, like I'm performing intelligence rather than actually being intelligent. Does that make sense?" I had reassured her, told her that her insights in their conversations seemed just as sophisticated as his, that she was clearly exceptionally bright. I remember feeling a wave of compassion for her, this girl who seemed to carry the same kind of intensity and self. Doubt that Leo did. I thought, these two understand each other in a way that's rare and precious. What I didn't understand then, what I couldn't have understood, was that sometimes the people who seem most vulnerable, most in need of reassurance, are also the most dangerous. Not because they're malicious by nature, but because their own need is so vast, so consuming, that it can swallow everything around them. The drowning don't always mean to pull their rescuers under, but they do it anyway. And that is the precise, psychological crucible where the most exquisite betrayals are forged. It's not about the breaking of a rule or a simple lie, not about the violation of an explicit promise or contract. Those betrayals hurt, certainly, but they're comprehensible. They fit into a framework we understand. Someone said they'd do X, they did Y instead. We adjust our expectations accordingly. The betrayal that destroys is something else entirely. It's about the violation of a shared reality, the annihilation of a mutual world that two people constructed together through 1,000 small acts of revelation and trust. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote extensively about the look, his concept of le regard, the idea that our sense of self is fundamentally shaped by how others perceive us. We don't exist in isolation, Sartre argued. We are always being, for others, constantly aware of ourselves as objects in someone else's consciousness. Our identity is not something we possess independently. It's something that emerges in the space between ourselves and others, in the recognition we receive from their gaze. In Maya's eyes, Leo saw a reflection of his best, most intelligent, most understood self. She was the mirror that showed him he was real, he was valuable, He was seen in his fullness. When you're a teenager, and perhaps when you're any age, but especially when you're young and still forming your sense of who you are, that recognition is not a luxury. It's oxygen. It's the confirmation that you exist in the way you think you exist, that your interior landscape is real and navigable by another consciousness. For Leo, who had always felt slightly out of step with his peers, slightly too intense, too serious, too interested in questions that made other kids' eyes glaze over, Maya's recognition was transformative. She didn't just tolerate his intensity, she matched it. She didn't just understand his references, she extended them, built on them, challenged them. In her presence, he wasn't too much. He was exactly enough. He was, perhaps for the first time in his young life, exactly right. To have that mirror not just crack, but to have it deliberately shattered by the one holding it. That is an existential crime. It doesn't just damage your heart, it unravels your very being. It calls into question not just the other person's character, but your own perception of reality. If you were so wrong about this person, about this relationship that felt more real than anything else in your life, what else are you wrong about? Can you trust your own judgment? Can you trust your own feelings? Can you trust anyone ever again? The relationship between Leo and Maya had a quality of sacred trust that I think is increasingly rare in our modern world. In an age of casual connections and strategic networking, where relationships are often implicitly transactional and everyone is building their personal brand, these two had created something that felt almost anachronistic, a pure intellectual and emotional bond that seemed to exist outside of social calculation. They shared everything, not just ideas but fears, not just philosophical positions, but personal vulnerabilities. Leo told me once, in a moment of unguarded happiness, that Maya was the only person who had ever seen his poetry. He'd been writing poems since he was 13, dense, complicated things full of classical allusions and existential yearning. But he'd never shown them to anyone, not even me. She gets them, he said simply. She doesn't just say they're good to be nice. She reads them like they matter. She, in turn, had confided in Leo about her own family struggles. A father who had left when she was young. A mother who oscillated between emotional unavailability and suffocating control. A deep fear that she was fundamentally unlovable. Leo had held these confidences like sacred objects. I'd hear him on the phone with her late at night, his voice low and steady, clearly talking her through some crisis of confidence or family drama. This is what made their bond so powerful, and what made the eventual betrayal so devastating. They had created a third thing between them, not just his self and herself, but a mutual world, a shared reality with its own language, its own reference points, its own meaning. They were co-authors of a story about who they were and what they meant to each other. Philosophers and psychologists have long recognized that trust is the foundational infrastructure of all meaningful human relationships. The psychoanalyst Erik Erikson identified basic trust versus mistrust as the first stage of psychosocial development. The philosopher Annette Bayer wrote about trust as a form of accepted vulnerability to another's power. The willing lowering of defenses in the belief that the other will not exploit that vulnerability. What Leo had given Maya was exactly this, complete vulnerability. He had lowered every defense, shared every part of himself, given her the map to his interior world, and she had done the same, or so he believed. They were mutually vulnerable, mutually seen, mutually safe. This wasn't naivete on Leo's part. It was the rational extension of a relationship that had, up until the moment of betrayal, been completely trustworthy. She had never given him reason to doubt her. Every piece of evidence suggested she was exactly who she appeared to be. His person, his intellectual twin, his safe harbor in a world that often felt hostile to sensitive souls. The betrayal itself was, from the outside looking in, a common, almost cliched cruelty of high school politics. The kind of thing that happens every day in 1,000 schools, that adults often dismiss with phrases like "kids can be cruel" or "it's a tough lesson to learn," as if the frequency of a wound somehow lessens its depth. But what appears mundane from the outside can be apocalyptic from within, and the specific mechanism of this betrayal was designed, whether consciously or unconsciously, to strike at the very heart of what Leo valued most: his ideas, his intellectual integrity, his trust in their mutual world. They were co-presidents of the debate team, a role they had campaigned for together, presenting themselves as a unified ticket, a partnership that would bring the team to new heights. It was a large, competitive team at a high-achieving school, and the captaincy meant something. It was a marker of intellectual credibility, a line on a college application, yes, but more importantly, it was a position of respect within a community that mattered to both of them. The team was preparing for a national championship tournament, the kind of high-stakes competition where students from across the country would gather to argue complex policy positions in front of judges who were often college professors or former champions themselves. The topic that year was something dense and multifaceted about geopolitical sovereignties, specifically, whether international bodies had the moral authority to intervene in sovereign nations' internal affairs for humanitarian purposes. It was the kind of topic that could be argued from a dozen different angles, requiring both philosophical sophistication and practical policy knowledge. Leo, with his typical all-consuming passion, had spent weeks doing what he did best: thinking deeply, reading widely, making connections that others missed. He'd gone beyond the standard research, diving into primary philosophical text, reading Carl Schmitt on sovereignty, Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism and human rights, Giorgio Agamben on states of exception. He'd stayed up until 3 in the morning, filling notebook after notebook with observations and arguments, building something new. And then one night, around 11 o'clock on a Thursday, he'd had his breakthrough moment. I heard him literally shout from upstairs a "yes, yes, that's it," with such excitement that I'd rushed up thinking something was wrong, only to find him at his desk, surrounded by open books and scattered papers, his face alive with the particular joy of intellectual discovery. "Mom, I figured it out," he'd said, barely able to sit still. Everyone argues this topic from either a realist perspective, sovereignty is absolute, intervention is imperialism, or from a humanitarian perspective, human rights transcend sovereignty. But what if the entire framework is wrong? What if sovereignty itself is not a fixed, natural category, but a historically contingent political technology? And the question isn't whether to violate it, but how to reimagine what sovereignty could mean in an interconnected world. I didn't fully understand it, but I understood that he'd discovered something that felt true and original to him, and I told him I was proud, told him to get some sleep, told him it sounded brilliant even though I was honestly only grasping about half of it. He had developed a novel, almost radical argument that drew on post-colonial theory and critical philosophy to essentially reframe the entire debate. It was risky, intellectually ambitious, the kind of thing that could either win spectacularly or fail completely depending on the judge's openness to non-traditional frameworks. But if executed correctly, it was brilliant, genuinely original in a context where most debaters were recycling the same standard arguments with slightly different evidence. He shared it with Maya, of course. How could he not? She was his intellectual partner, his co-president, the person whose judgment he trusted more than his own. They spent weeks refining it together, late into the night, their minds intertwined in a single, purposeful pursuit. They'd meet in coffee shops and work through the argument's weaknesses. They'd video chat and practice delivery. They'd text each other articles and quotes that could strengthen the position. I'd hear fragments of their conversations. But how do we answer the inevitable critic that we're just replacing one power structure with another? What if we preempt that by acknowledging the impossibility of a perfect solution? Yes, exactly. We make the argument that politics is always the art of the least bad option. And our framework at least opens space for marginalized voices in the sovereignty conversation. And Maya, to her credit, or perhaps to her strategic cunning, contributed substantially to the refinement process. She helped stress test the argument, found weaknesses, suggested ways to make it more persuasive. Leo interpreted this naturally as intellectual partnership. They were building something together, a shared creation. In his mind, it was like a song they'd written together, a joint project that belonged equally to both of them. The fact that the initial insight had been his seemed irrelevant in the context of their broader collaboration. What he didn't realize, what I didn't realize, was that Maya was not collaborating. She was learning. She was taking detailed notes, not as a partner, but as a competitor. She was mapping the argument with the precision of a cartographer charting territory she intended to claim. The day of the final team selection arrived in mid-March. The format was straightforward. Each candidate for the championship team would present their best argument to the full team and the faculty advisor. It was meant to be a collegial process, a way to determine who had the strongest positions and who would represent the school. Leo, naturally, assumed he and Maya would both make the team. After all, they were co-residents, and they'd both been working so hard. Maybe they'd even present their shared argument as a joint effort, demonstrating their partnership. He had prepared meticulously. He'd barely slept the night before, running through his delivery, making sure every citation was perfect, every logical step clear. He'd chosen to wear a suit. He almost never wore a suit, because he wanted to signal the seriousness of his ideas. When I saw him that morning, straightening his tie in the mirror, he looked both excited and terrified in the way that people look before important moments that could define their futures. "You're going to be amazing," I told him, fixing his collar, noting the shadows under his eyes from too many late nights of preparation. "I hope so," he said. "This argument, I really think it could matter, Mom, not just for the tournament, but actually matter. Like it could change how people think about the issue." That was Leo. Always believing that ideas could matter, that words could change the world, that if you thought carefully enough and spoke truthfully enough, you could make a difference. It was the most beautiful thing about him, and it was the very quality that made him so vulnerable to someone willing to exploit it. The presentation room was the school library. Furniture pushed aside to create space for the full debate team, about 20 students, plus the faculty advisor, Mr. Chen, who had been coaching the debate team for 15 years and took his role with profound seriousness. Leo told me later the atmosphere was tense but not hostile, competitive but supposedly collegial. Several students presented their arguments. Some were solid, well-researched, competent. None were particularly original. Leo stood to present third. His mouth was dry, his heart pounding, but once he started speaking, he found his rhythm. He began to lay out the foundation of his brilliant, carefully constructed, lovingly refined idea. He spoke about the history of sovereignty as a concept, traced it from the Peace of Westphalia through the post-colonial moment. He explained how current debates were trapped in binary thinking. He built toward his reconceptualization, his new framework for understanding intervention and sovereignty as dialectically related rather than opposed. He was about 8 minutes into his 12-minute presentation, just reaching the crucial turning point where the argument would crystallize when Maya raised her hand. This was unusual. The protocol was to listen to complete presentations and then ask questions. But Maya, as co-president, had a certain latitude. Mr. Chen nodded at her permission to speak. "I appreciate Leo's historical overview," she began, her voice calm and professional. "But I think we need to address a fundamental flaw in this approach before we go further." Leo stopped mid-sentence, confused. They had rehearsed this argument together. She knew every word, every turn. What flaw was she talking about? Was this some kind of friendly challenge, a way to let him demonstrate his ability to defend the position? But it wasn't. With a calm, polished smile, she proceeded to eviscerate him. Not by disagreeing with the basic premise, not by offering an alternative framework, but by presenting his own argument, the one they had built together in sacred confidence over countless hours of collaboration, as her own. She used his exact words, his specific philosophical frameworks, his unique turns of phrase, his careful citations of Agamben and Arendt, his connection between post-colonial theory and sovereignty discourse, all of it. But she presented them with a slight but crucial twist, positioning his original concept as a flawed, preliminary version of thinking, a necessary but insufficient stepping stone to her own, more developed and sophisticated thesis. She essentially performed the intellectual equivalent of stealing someone's lyrics and melody, and then claiming that the original song was just a rough draft that she'd had to fix. What Leo is attempting, she said, her voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who has rehearsed this performance, is admirable in its ambition, but it falls into the trap of theoretical abstraction without practical application. The framework he's proposing, and I say he's proposing because this is clearly where his thinking has stopped, needs several crucial additions to actually function in a real-world policy context. She then proceeded to add those crucial additions, which were, in fact, extensions and refinements that they had developed together, that had come out of their mutual conversations, that Leo had assumed were part of their shared intellectual property. She presented them as if she had thought of them independently, as if she had taken Leo's rough sketch and turned it into a complete picture. The room was silent. A few students glanced between Leo and Maya, sensing that something strange was happening, but not quite understanding what. Mr. Chen was taking notes, nodding along, clearly impressed by what sounded like a sophisticated argument emerging from a critique of a previous presentation. Leo stood frozen at the front of the room. Later, he would tell me that he experienced a kind of dissociation in that moment, as if his consciousness had split in two. One part of him was still trying to process what was happening. Surely this was a misunderstanding. Surely she would acknowledge their collaboration. Surely this was some kind of strange pedagogical choice he didn't understand. The other part of him, the part that understood immediately and completely, felt like he'd been punched in the chest, like the air had been sucked out of the room, like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. When Maya finished her presentation, really, her presentation of their work as her work, she returned to her seat. The applause was generous. Mr. Chen was beaming, clearly delighted by what he saw as an excellent example of peer critique and intellectual development. A few students clapped Leo on the shoulder sympathetically, assuming he'd just been out, debated, which was a normal part of competitive academics. Leo somehow made it through the rest of his presentation, but the life had gone out of it. He couldn't continue with his original argument because she had literally stolen it. He tried to pivot, to salvage something, but his mind was reeling, and his attempt to articulate an alternative position on the spot was incoherent. He sat down knowing he had failed, knowing that he would not make the championship team, but more importantly, knowing that something much more fundamental had been destroyed. I heard about the details later from Mr. Chen, who called me that evening because he was concerned about Leo. He left immediately after the presentations. Mr. Chen said, his voice troubled. He didn't wait for the results, didn't speak to anyone. Mrs. Anderson, I'm not sure what happened, but I've never seen Leo like that. He looked broken. Mr. Chen didn't understand what had happened. How could he, from his perspective? He'd witnessed a fairly standard academic competition where one strong argument had been constructively criticized and improved upon by another student. He had no way of knowing about the hours of late, night collaboration, the sacred trust, the intellectual intimacy that had been violated. But what I witnessed that Tuesday night, when Leo finally came home after walking around for 5 hours in the cold March wind, was the aftermath. It wasn't just disappointment or embarrassment or even anger, though all of those would come later. It was something more fundamental, more terrifying. He came into the kitchen where I was pretending to read, though I'd been unable to focus on anything since Mr. Chen's call. He sat down at the table without taking off his jacket. His face was pale, his eyes red, rimmed but dry, as if he'd moved beyond the place where tears were possible. He looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. A kind of radical doubt, as if the basic furniture of his reality had been rearranged, and he no longer knew how to navigate the room. "Tell me what happened," I said quietly, and he did. In a voice that was eerily calm, almost clinical, he described the entire scene. He spoke about Maya's presentation like he was describing a car accident, with the shocked detachment of someone who has witnessed something impossible. He explained the argument that had been stolen, the collaborative process that had been betrayed, the public humiliation that had been performed. But that wasn't what had broken him. It wasn't the loss of the debate spot that had shattered something fundamental. It was a specific moment, a specific image that he kept returning to in his recounting. It was the look, he said, staring at a point somewhere past my shoulder. When she finished her presentation and walked back to her seat, her eyes met mine for just a second, and Mom. His voice finally cracked here. It wasn't even guilt. It wasn't anger or defensiveness or even triumph. It was nothing, a blank, as if the person I knew had simply been erased, and a stranger was operating her face. Like she was wearing a Maya costume, but the person underneath was someone I'd never met. He was quiet for a long moment, and I waited, not knowing what to say, not having any words adequate to what was happening. It was like watching my own history being rewritten in real time. He continued. Every late-night conversation, every moment I thought we were building something together, every time I trusted her with something personal, suddenly all of it became suspect. Did any of it mean what I thought it meant? Was every conversation just reconnaissance for her? Was I ever her friend? Was I always just a resource to be mined? This is the core of the trauma. This is what people who haven't experienced profound betrayal don't understand. It's not just about the specific act of betrayal, the stolen argument or broken promise, or whatever form the violation takes. It's that betrayal is a form of retroactive violence. It reaches backward through time and contaminates everything that came before it. Every good memory becomes a question mark. Every moment of trust becomes a moment of foolishness. Every vulnerability you shared becomes a weapon you handed to your enemy. Betrayal is a form of gaslighting, though we rarely name it as such. It forces you to question not just the other person, but your own perception, your own memory, your own judgment. It creates a terrible cognitive dissonance. The relationship you experienced as loving and genuine was, apparently, experienced completely differently by the other person. So which version was real? If you could be so profoundly wrong about something that felt so certain, what else are you wrong about? The love Leo felt was real. Its object was suddenly, terrifyingly, false, or not false exactly, but fictional. The Maya he loved, the brilliant, vulnerable, trustworthy intellectual partner, apparently never existed, or existed only as a performance, a strategic presentation designed to gain access to his ideas and his trust. The person sitting across the debate room, presenting his argument as her own with that blank look in her eyes, was the real Maya, and that Maya was a stranger. This creates a cognitive dissonance so violent that the mind doesn't know how to process it. It's like those optical illusions where you're looking at a young woman, and then suddenly you see an old crone, and you can't understand how you ever saw the young woman, how you ever missed the crone that was always there. The one who was the source of your safety becomes the source of your deepest peril. The place you went for comfort becomes the origin of your pain. It's a psychological ambush. The philosopher Judith Clark wrote about the relationship between betrayal and cruelty. She argued that betrayal is particularly cruel because it exploits the victim's best qualities, their capacity for trust, for openness, for love, and turns those virtues into vulnerabilities. The more trusting you are, the more devastating the betrayal. The more you loved, the deeper the wound. Your strength becomes the mechanism of your destruction. For Leo, the person who could hurt him most was Maya precisely because he had given her the most power. He had handed her his heart, his ideas, his vulnerabilities, his dreams, believing, rationally, based on all available evidence, that she would handle them with care, and she had taken everything he offered and used it against him. In the days that followed that awful Tuesday evening, I watched my son go through the stages of a grief more complex than any death I'd helped him process. When his grandfather died 2 years earlier, Leo had cried openly, had been sad in a clear, comprehensible way. There was a trajectory to that grief, sharp and terrible at first, then gradually softening as time passed. Death is an ending, a tragedy with a certain brutal finality, yes, but also a kind of clarity. The person is gone. You grieve them, you miss them, but you don't question the reality of what you had with them. Betrayal is different. Betrayal is a wound that keeps reopening. Betrayal is a grief without a body, a loss without an ending. The person is still there, still walking the same hallways, still existing in the world, but the relationship, the entire shared reality you thought you were living in, is revealed to have been a fiction. And you're left holding this impossible paradox, grieving something that apparently never existed while also knowing that for you, it was the most real thing in your life. Leo cycled through emotional states like someone with a terrible fever, his consciousness burning through one feeling and then another, unable to find a stable place to rest. First came the shock, the numb disbelief. For about 48 hours, he moved through the house like a ghost, mechanically going through the motions of basic life, showering, eating a few bites when I put food in front of him, staring at homework he couldn't process. He barely spoke. I'd ask him questions and he'd give one-word answers, as if language itself had become too heavy to lift. His eyes had a faraway quality, as if he was constantly watching the scene replay in his mind, the moment Maya's eyes met his across that room. Then came the rage. It arrived on Thursday night like a storm front moving through. I heard a crash from his room and ran upstairs to find that he'd swept everything off his desk. Books, papers, his laptop, all of it on the floor. He was standing in the middle of the wreckage, breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists. She stole it, he said, his voice shaking with an anger so black it frightened both of us. She looked me in the fucking eyes and stole it and felt nothing. What kind of person does that? What kind of person? He couldn't finish. He punched the wall, not hard enough to break anything but hard enough that I worried about his hand. Leo, I started. Don't, he said. Don't tell me it's going to be okay. Don't tell me she's not worth it. Don't tell me any of the bullshit adults say when they want you to stop feeling something. So I didn't. I sat down on his bed, in the middle of the chaos of his room, and I let him rage. He paced, he swore. He said things about Maya that were cruel and unusual and probably deserved. He spiraled into dark philosophical territory about how Hobbes was right, how humans are fundamentally selfish, how trust is just a weakness that evolution should have selected out of the species by now. Every philosopher who wrote about the inherent brutality of human nature, every cynical political theorist, every misanthrope, they were all right, he said bitterly. And I was the idiot who believed in some idealistic bullshit about authentic connection and intellectual community. She must have been laughing at me the whole time. Look at the naive little boy who thinks I actually care about him. I let him burn through it. I've read enough about trauma to know that anger is part of the process, that it's actually healthier than the numb shock, that it means the psyche is trying to defend itself, trying to build walls against future harm. But it was hard to watch. This was my child who had cried when we had to return a lost dog to its owner because he'd gotten attached. My child who wrote poetry about the inherent beauty of the natural world. To hear him speak with such corrosive cynicism was like watching a language I didn't recognize coming out of his mouth. The rage phase lasted about a week, and then came the sadness, and this was worse. If the anger had been a fire, this was a flood, a rising water that seemed like it might drown him. He stopped going to school, not because he refused. He didn't have the energy to refuse. He simply couldn't get out of bed. I let him stay home for 2 days before I got worried enough to call the school, to explain vaguely that he was dealing with a personal crisis and needed some time. On the 3rd day, I sat on the edge of his bed. He was just lying there, staring at the ceiling, still in his pajamas at 2 in the afternoon. And I tried to reach him, talk to me. I said softly, "Please." About what? His voice was hollow, scraped clean of effect. About how I'm a terrible judge of character. About how the person I thought was my soulmate was actually using me the entire time. About how every good memory I have with her is now poisoned. You're not a terrible judge of character, Leo. You're trusting. Those aren't the same thing. He laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. Right, trusting, that's a nice word for gullible. It's not, "I loved her, Mom." He said it simply, and tears finally spilled from the corners of his eyes, tracking into his hair. Not romantically, or maybe romantically, I don't even know, but I loved her. I thought we were the same kind of weird. I thought we'd found each other in a world that doesn't make space for people like us. And it turns out I was just, what, a research assistant, a source to cite, was any of it real? This was the question he kept circling back to, the unanswerable question that was tormenting him. Was any of it real? Had she ever cared about him at all? Had there ever been a genuine connection, or had the entire friendship been a performance, a long con designed to gain access to his ideas and insights? I don't know. I admitted, because I wouldn't lie to him. I don't know what was real for her, but I know what was real for you. Your love was real. Your trust was real. The person you were in that friendship, that was the real you. He turned his face away from me. A lot of good that does. The sadness lasted longer than the rage. It seeped into everything. He went back to school eventually, but he was a shadow of himself. He sat alone at lunch. He stopped participating in class discussions. Several teachers emailed me, concerned. Leo just isn't himself. They wrote, he seems distant, disengaged. Is everything okay at home? But perhaps the most disturbing phase was what came next, the chilling, philosophical detachment. About 3 weeks after the betrayal, something shifted in Leo. The sadness didn't disappear, but it was overlaid with a kind of intellectual distance, as if he had decided to treat his own pain as a subject for analysis rather than a feeling to be experienced. He started talking about the inherent selfishness of human nature, as if he were discussing a specimen under glass. He'd make observations at dinner, casual, emotionless statements about evolutionary psychology and game theory, and why cooperation is just a strategy for long-term self-interest. Altruism is a myth, he announced one evening over pasta, his voice calm and analytical. What looks like selflessness is always, at its root, self-interest. We're nice to people because we want something from them, or because being nice costs us less than being cruel in terms of social capital. Maya wasn't an aberration. She was just more honest about the calculation than most people are. Leo, that's not, I started. It's not what? True, Mom, look at the evidence. Every relationship is fundamentally transactional. Every trust is provisional. Every connection is strategic. The sooner we accept that, the less we'll be hurt when people inevitably betray us. This frightened me more than the rage or the sadness. This was Leo trying to protect himself by burning down his own capacity for trust, by preemptively destroying his ability to be hurt. It was like watching someone try to prevent drowning by refusing to ever go near water again. Technically effective, perhaps, but at the cost of everything beautiful and necessary that water makes possible. He was wrestling, though he didn't name it this way, with one of the oldest and most intractable problems in philosophy, The problem of other minds. How do we know that other people have inner experiences like our own? How do we know that they genuinely feel the emotions they express, that they mean the things they say, that they're not just sophisticated automatons performing humanity? In normal life, we don't think about this problem. We operate on a kind of generous default assumption. Other people are basically like us, with their own internal landscapes, their own genuine feelings and thoughts. We take their words at face value. We read their body language and assume it corresponds to actual inner states. We build relationships on the faith that mutual understanding is possible. This faith is necessary for any kind of meaningful human connection. Without it, we're trapped in solipsistic isolation, forever uncertain whether anyone else truly exists in the way we do. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote about this extensively, arguing that doubt about other minds is actually incoherent, that the very language we use to describe mental states is learned in social contexts and assumes shared experience. But betrayal shatters this generous assumption. It forces you to confront the fact that you actually don't have direct access to another person's consciousness. You only have their performance, their presentation, their words and actions, which might or might not correspond to genuine inner states. Maya's performance had been so convincing, her presentation of friendship and care so perfectly executed, that Leo had never thought to doubt it. Why would he? She had given him no reason to question her sincerity, until she had, and now every relationship was suspect. We can never truly know what is in another person's head. We operate on faith. We build bridges of trust across the chasm of individual consciousness. Maya didn't just break a promise, she blew up the entire bridge, leaving him stranded on his own island of doubt, terrified to ever build another connection again. I watched this manifest in his daily life. He started to see potential betrayal everywhere. In a casual comment from a friend that seemed maybe slightly sarcastic, in a delayed text message that might mean someone was deliberately ignoring him, in a lunch invitation that could be an attempt to get something from him rather than a genuine desire for his company. One evening, his friend Marcus called. They'd been friends since middle school, a solid, uncomplicated friendship based on a shared love of strategy games and bad action movies. I heard Leo's side of the conversation. Hey, yeah, I'm okay. No, I can't this weekend because I'm busy. Marcus, what do you want? No, I mean, what do you actually want? You haven't called me in 2 weeks and now suddenly you want to hang out. Did you hear about what happened with Maya? Is this a pity thing? I'm not being paranoid, I'm being realistic. The call ended badly. I heard the frustration in Marcus's voice even through the phone, and I watched Leo hang up and immediately retreat to his room, confirmed in his new world view that everyone has an angle, everyone is performing, everyone wants something. The world had become a hostile place, full of hidden traps and false mirrors. Every interaction was now a potential site of betrayal. Every vulnerability was a risk he couldn't afford to take. He was trying to make himself invulnerable by making himself closed, trying to prevent future pain by eliminating the possibility of future connection. I understood the logic. If you never trust anyone, you can never be betrayed. If you never love anyone deeply, you can never be deeply hurt. If you treat every relationship as provisional and strategic, you'll never be surprised when it ends. It was a perfectly rational response to trauma. It was also a kind of death. As his mother, my every instinct was to fix it, to march into that school and demand justice, to call Maya's parents and tell them exactly what their daughter had done, to email Mr. Chen with a detailed account of the intellectual theft and demand that Maya be removed from the debate team, to write a letter to the school administration, to scream from the rooftops about the injustice of what had been done to my child. I drafted emails I never sent. I rehearsed conversations in the shower, eloquent speeches about ethics and integrity that I never delivered. I lay awake at night, imagining confrontations with Maya, with her parents, with the school, playing out scenarios where I could somehow force an acknowledgement of the harm that had been done, extract an apology, restore my son's faith in humanity through the mechanism of external justice. But I knew, with a chilling certainty that sat in my stomach like a stone, that this was not a wound that could be healed by external justice. Even if Maya confessed, even if she apologized, even if she were punished in some official capacity, none of that would fix what had been broken. This wasn't about fairness or consequences or social justice, though all of those things mattered in their own way. This was an internal war, a battle for Leo's soul, and he had to be the one to fight it. What he needed from me was not a champion or an avenger. What he needed was a harbor. A safe place to return to when the internal war became too much, a steady point of reference in a world that had become unstable, a love that was unconditional and unkillable, that asked nothing of him except that he keep breathing. So that's what I tried to be. I made soup. His favorite, a white bean and escarole soup with lemon that he'd loved since he was small, and didn't force him to eat it when he barely touched it. I just left it on the counter in case he got hungry later, left it as evidence that someone was thinking about him, caring for his body even when he couldn't. I sat with him in silence for hours. Sometimes we'd be in the living room together, me reading or pretending to read, him just staring out the window or lying on the couch. I didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes or forced optimism. I just sat with him so he would know he wasn't alone on his island of doubt and pain. I was a steady, quiet presence, a lighthouse whose beam couldn't guide him to a specific shore, couldn't solve his problems or heal his wounds, but could at least show him that some land, some love, was still solid and real. That not all foundations were false, that at least one person in his universe was reliable, was there, would remain there regardless of what he did or didn't do, regardless of whether he was brilliant or broken, successful or struggling. This kind of love, patient, steady, undemanding, is perhaps the least dramatic but most vital form of parenting. Our culture celebrates the parent who fights the school board, who confronts the bully, who takes dramatic action to protect their child. And sometimes that's necessary, but sometimes what's needed is just presence, constancy, the knowledge that whatever happens out in the world, there is a place to come home to where you are unconditionally valued. I also tried, gently, to help him see that his pain was not his identity, that he was more than this wound. When he'd start spiraling into bitter philosophical territory about the fundamental corruption of human nature, I'd sometimes push back, not aggressively, but enough to offer an alternative perspective. So you think everyone is fundamentally selfish? I asked one night when he was in one of his detached, analytical moods. The evidence suggests it. He said, his voice flat, "What about you?" I asked. "When you saved that sparrow, what were you getting out of it?" "The feeling of being a good person, the emotional satisfaction. It was still self-interested, just in a more complicated way." "Okay," I said. "What about when you tutored that kid in your math class last year, the one who was struggling? You spent hours helping him and you barely knew him. What did you get out of that?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. It felt like the right thing to do." "Exactly," I said softly. "Sometimes people do things because they feel right, because we have capacities for empathy and compassion that don't reduce cleanly to self-interest. Maya hurt you terribly, that's real. But she's one person, Leo. She's not evidence of a universal law. She's not the only one who's ever betrayed someone." He countered. "People betray each other all the time. It's basically the human condition." Yes, I agreed. And people also love each other, sacrifice for each other, show up for each other. That's also the human condition. Both are true. You get to choose which truth you want to build your life around. These conversations didn't fix anything, but I hoped they planted seeds. tiny alternative possibilities in the scorched earth of his world. I hoped that later, when he had more distance, when the wound wasn't so fresh, he might remember them and find some use in them. Part 9. The sparrow, the turning point, as it often is with deep philosophical wounds, came from an unexpected source and arrived without warning. It had been about 6 weeks since the betrayal, and Leo had settled into a kind of gray functionality. He was going to school, doing his homework, speaking when spoken to, but he was operating at half capacity, like a machine running on minimal power to conserve energy. The light in his eyes, that intense, focused beam that had always characterized him, was dim. It was a Saturday in late April, one of those perfect spring days where everything feels possible and alive. I'd been trying to coax him outside all morning. Let's go for a walk. Why don't you ride your bike? With no success. He just shrugged me off, stayed in his room with the curtains drawn. Then, around 3 in the afternoon, I heard the front door open and close. I looked out the window and saw him walking down the street in the direction of the small park a few blocks from our house. He wasn't wearing a jacket, even though there was still a chill in the air, and something about the determined set of his shoulders made me worried. But I let him go. Part of being a harbor is knowing when to let the ship leave, trusting it will come back. He was gone for over 2 hours. When the light started to fade and he still wasn't back, I started to truly worry. Was about to go looking for him when I heard the door open again. He came into the kitchen, and I could tell immediately something had shifted. He was soaked, not from rain but from being outside in the weather, his hair plastered to his head, his clothes damp. He'd been sitting somewhere in the rain, I realized, just letting it fall on him. But his face had a different quality. Not happy, exactly. Still sad, but somehow more present, more alive than he'd been in weeks. I've been at the park, he said, sitting on the floor next to my chair like he used to do when he was a little boy, when he'd want to be close but not be held. Just sitting on a bench. It started raining about an hour ago, but I didn't want to leave. I waited, not wanting to interrupt whatever was happening. I've been thinking, he continued, his voice still raw but with more life in it. About the sparrow, about Cicero. My heart thudded in my chest. I stayed quiet when it flew away. He said, staring at the pattern on the kitchen rug, his fingers tracing the woven design absently. I was sad, but I was also happy. Do you remember that? I cried, but they weren't really sad tears. They were. He searched for the word, overwhelmed tears, because the point wasn't to keep it. The point was never to keep it. The point was the caring. The act itself was the thing. The fact that it flew away didn't make those 2 weeks of caring for it meaningless. It made them more meaningful, actually. Because they were pure, I wasn't doing it to get something back. I was doing it because that's what you do when you see something suffering. He took a shaky breath, and I saw tears building in his eyes, but they were different tears than the ones I'd seen over the past weeks. These were clearer, cleaner somehow. Maybe loving Maya was like that. He said quietly, the words coming slowly as if he was discovering them as he spoke them. The fact that she turned out to be different doesn't make the love I felt any less real or any less beautiful. It was my love. It came from me. It was about my capacity to care deeply, to be intellectually intimate with someone, to build that whole world of ideas and trust. She destroyed the shared world we'd built, but she can't destroy the fact that I was capable of building it. That capacity, that's mine. In that moment, I saw the first flicker of empowerment in the tragedy. He was performing a profound act of psychological reframing. He was separating the beauty of his own capacity to love from the ugliness of the other person's actions. He was reclaiming his own narrative. The betrayal is her story. He continued, his voice getting stronger. It's her choice, her moral failing, her corruption, I guess. But the love, that was my story. It's a testament to my character, not a reflection of hers. She can take a lot of things from me. My argument, my trust, my sense of safety. But she can't take the fact that I love deeply, and honestly, that's mine. This is the most vital lesson we can learn from the crucible of betrayal, and I was watching my 17-year-old son discover it in real time, piece by painful piece. We live in a culture, a Western individualistic narrative, that often tells us to guard our hearts, to build walls, to love conditionally, to protect ourselves from potential hurt. We are taught that vulnerability is a weakness, that being hurt means you were foolish, that the proper response to betrayal is to close yourself off to prevent it from happening again. The entire self-help industry is built around this idea. Protect yourself, set boundaries, don't give too much, keep your options open, guard your heart like it's a treasure that might be stolen. And yes, boundaries are important. Discernment is important, but there's a difference between wise discernment and terrified closure. My son's journey was teaching me the opposite of that cultural narrative. The tragedy isn't in being betrayed. The tragedy would be in allowing that betrayal to kill your capacity to love, to trust, to be open. The tragedy would be in letting Maya's corruption corrupt him, in letting her cruelty make him cruel, in letting her closure make him closed. "I think," he said slowly, still sitting on the floor beside my chair, his head now resting against my leg like it used to when he was small, "that being hurt like this means I love something real. Even if it wasn't what I thought it was, even if it was asymmetrical, my genuine love for her performance. I still loved, and that's better than never having loved at all. That's not just a cliche, it's actually true. Yes," I said softly, running my fingers through his wet hair. "Yes, baby, it is." Leo's pain didn't vanish overnight, and I don't want to give the impression that one revelatory moment in the rain fixed everything. Healing is not linear. It doesn't follow a neat narrative arc where a single insight solves the problem and the protagonist emerges transformed and whole. Real healing is messy, recursive, full of setbacks and repetitions. There were still bad days, days when he'd see Meyer in the hallway at school and come home shaking with anger all over again. Days when he'd spiral back into cynical philosophizing about human nature. Days when he'd withdraw into himself, and I'd worry that he was slipping back into that gray half. Life he'd been living in the weeks after the betrayal. But slowly, incrementally, he began to rebuild. Not to return to who he was before. You can't return to innocence once you've lost it. But to become someone new. Someone who contained both the capacity for deep love and the knowledge of deep betrayal. Someone who was scarred but not broken. He started to understand that the wound was also a teacher. It had taught him something important about discernment, about the difference between trust and naivety, about reading people more carefully. But more importantly, more profoundly, it had taught him something about himself. "I know what I'm capable of now," he told me one evening, several months after the betrayal. We were sitting on the back porch, watching fireflies emerge in the dusk. "I know that I can love someone so completely that their betrayal feels like the end of the world, and I survived it. I'm still here. That's actually kind of powerful, isn't it? Like, she did her worst and I'm still standing." "Yes," I said. "That is powerful. I don't want to become someone who can't be hurt," he continued. "I thought I did for a while. I thought the goal was to be invulnerable, to be so defended that nothing could touch me. But that's not strength, that's just shutting down. Real strength is knowing you can be hurt and choosing to stay open anyway." This was wisdom far beyond his 17 years, earned through suffering, which is often how wisdom comes to us. He was learning that courage isn't the absence of fear or pain. It's the willingness to be afraid and pained and to act anyway, to love anyway, to trust anyway. He started to cautiously rebuild friendships. He apologized to Marcus for pushing him away, and Marcus, with the easy forgiveness of true friendship, just shrugged and said, "You were going through some shit. I get it. Want to come over and play Elden Ring?" He joined a different extracurricular, the literary magazine Instead of Debate, where he found a new community of intense, creative kids who appreciated his philosophical bent. He started writing again, poetry that was darker and more complex than his earlier work, full of imagery about breaking and rebuilding, about foundations and fault lines. He went on his first date with a girl named Sophia from his English class and came home terrified and exhilarated. What if I can't trust my own judgment? He asked me. What if I think someone is genuine and they're not? Then you'll survive that too, I told him. And you'll know even more about yourself. But Leo, you can't let one person's betrayal prevent you from ever trying again. That would be letting Maya win. That would be letting her take not just your argument, but your entire future. He was learning to build a new kind of love, one that was not naive, but was conscious and courageous. A love that understood risk, but chose connection anyway. A love that was rooted not in the flawless character of the other person, because no one is flawless, everyone is capable of causing harm, but in the unshakable integrity of his own capacity to love. This is perhaps the most important distinction, the one that our culture rarely teaches us. Your ability to love deeply, to trust fully, to be vulnerable and open. These are not weaknesses. They're not mistakes to be corrected. They are your greatest strengths, the things that make you fully human, fully alive. When you're betrayed, it's tempting to think, I was wrong to trust, wrong to love, wrong to be open. But that's giving the betrayer too much power. That's letting their corruption define your character. The truth is, you were right to love, the love was good. The trust was appropriate given the evidence you had. The openness was brave and beautiful. The other person's decision to betray that love, that trust, that openness, that's about them. That's their moral failing, their choice, their story. Your story is about what you're capable of. And what my son discovered he was capable of, what his betrayal ultimately revealed, was a capacity for love and connection and intellectual intimacy that was rare and precious. Maya's betrayal couldn't take that capacity away. It could wound it, test it, force it to evolve, but it couldn't destroy it unless he let it. 1 year later, Leo was preparing for college applications. He decided to write his main essay about the betrayal, not the details of what happened, but what he'd learned from it. He showed me a draft one evening, and I read it sitting at that same kitchen table where he'd first told me about Maya's betrayal. The essay was titled The Sparrow and the Philosopher, and it began with the story of Cicero, the bird he'd saved when he was 10. It moved through his friendship with Maya, though he'd changed her name and obscured identifying details, and it ended with this passage. The philosopher Kierkegaard wrote,